Hello, welcome to the Raw podcast brought to you by the Sunderland Echo. My name is Jason Jones, joined by James Copley. No Phil Smith this week. He's on Reg press conference duties, so you're stuck with the two of us, but I'm sure we'll muddle through it, won't we, James? Not really the conversation we're going to be having on a Monday morning, is it? Sunderland obviously recording their second loss of the championship campaign. Has James Copley disappeared on me? That's the question that I'm asking. 2-1 defeat at Watford. Went down to Vicarage Road.
Apologies.
You're back? You with me?
I'm back. A hairy moment there.
Wonder where you went there. I was 2-1 defeat at Vicarage Road. Obviously fell behind in the first half. A pretty flat first half display, I think it's fair to say, from Sunderland. Came back into the game. And then late on, Dan Neil conceded a penalty. Watford came away with all 3 points. I mean, obviously you were at the match, James. Just interested to get your thoughts on it all, really.
Yeah, I thought the first sort of 30 minutes was really poor by Sunderland's pretty reasonable high standards that they've set so far this season. I thought Watford looked really powerful. Sunderland's press wasn't there. Watford were counter-attacking quite well. That midfield balance didn't look quite right for Sunderland, surprisingly. I'm loath to criticise him because I absolutely love him, but I think it was probably Chris Rigg's sort of worst half in a Sunderland shirt. I think that's fair to say. I mean, he didn't have a howler or anything, but he wasn't exerting his usual influence, which I guess in its own way is a massive compliment to him and his talents and the standards he's already set for himself, because he is so young and that is worth remembering. So I'm not criticising Chris Rigg too heavily, but I just thought Sunderland were off it. I thought Watford's midfield really sort of disrupted them. Moussa Sissoko, I was hoping to see that his legs had gone, and he was actually quite good in the middle of the park. He dictated things really well. So it was a disappointing sort of opening 30 minutes. I thought Sunderland came back into it well towards the back end of the first half, and then started the second half really well with good value for the equaliser. And as the game wore on, I thought if there was one team that was going to win it, it was actually going to be Sunderland. The caveat to that is that Hume produced a good block. I think it was in the second half. And Watford did have chances, but I did feel like Sunderland were in the ascendancy, and then that penalty, I think, comes against the run of play. It's obviously a daft decision by Dan Neil to go in there. We'll talk about it. I did think he struggled in that 6 role. But yeah, really frustrating day at the office, especially because I think the 2 games Sunderland have lost this season against Plymouth and Watford in the league, I think they probably should have had something out of both, and individual errors of sort of let them down a little bit. But I think, still second in the league, onwards to a really big week coming up at the Stadium of Light against Derby County on Tuesday, Leeds United on Saturday. 4 points, 6 points, and then all is sort of forgotten, isn't it? So really frustrating, I think, especially because the away end was so excellent as well. It would have been fantastic to see the carnage if there was a late winner, but unfortunately it went the other way.
I mean, you mentioned there, obviously, 2 games now that Sunderland have dropped points in the Championship, but 2 performances that on balance probably warranted at least a point out the back of them. I mean, Reg Lebris seemed fairly upbeat in the aftermath of this game. And do you think maybe there's that sort of recognition there from him that even though the results haven't gone the right way, there's a character in this Sunderland team and they can dig themselves out of holes and they can, give a good enough account of themselves to suggest that maybe, they shouldn't be losing these matches?
I think the head coach was really pleased that Sunderland had found themselves struggling in a game tactically, and they've managed to sort of correct that for large parts of the second half. He was, moderately upbeat, I would say, although he's never too high and never too low. I think that's the beauty of Regis Lebris, is he's never one way or the other. Like when Sunderland have won a significant amount of games at the start of the season, he's never too sort of out there. He sort of tempered expectations, and it was sort of similar with the loss. He said it was aspects of the game were pleasing for him because, Sunderland are building that culture, building that game model. But he also recognised as well that while Sunderland are building the culture and the game model and learning about each other and learning about the way Lebris wants to play, is that they also have to win games and have set a good standard for themselves. So, yeah, it was a very typical post-match Regis Lebris interview. He was very, very good. on the intricacies of the game where he thought it went wrong. He was full of praise for Watford as well. And then it came to injuries, and he was quite coy about that. So it's just, typical Labrie, not too high, not too low. And I think that's a good quality for this young Sunderland squad at the moment. He spoke a little bit about Dan Neil as well, and he actually praised Dan Neil for aspects of his performance, the tactical discipline to sort of drop into a back five at times against Watford. He did look out of sorts to me in the six, Dan Neil. But yeah, it's just, it is hugely frustrating because I think Sunderland were good value for a point, and they had chances as well. Obviously, the positive with Isidore scoring as well. But yeah, onwards to the next one.
I mean, obviously, Dan Neil has been a large topic of conversation in the aftermath of the match. It does feel as if his performances of late have been seized upon a little bit by the fan base. I mean, when we're talking about Saturday's game, you're saying he maybe didn't quite look himself. I mean, what do you put that down to? And also, the penalty, it's a bad tackle. I think we can all agree it's a daft mistake. The lad's come out and said it himself. But, is it important to sort of have some perspective here, keep some context as to how good he's been generally over the past however many seasons now?
Yeah, I think he's played something like 130 games in the AFL at 22 years old, which is a phenomenal achievement. For the majority of those games, he's been good. I think there's a microscope on Dan Neil because of the captaincy. There's a lot of chatter about whether the captaincy is weighing heavy on him as a local lad, as an academy graduate, as a player who is, yes, experienced, but still relatively young in life at 22 years old. I find it very hard to analyse that personally, because there are leaders within Sunderland's group as well sharing that responsibility. But we are only 7 games into his captaincy. So I find it very, very difficult to sort of say that it's changed him as a player, or that it's weighing heavily. Perhaps it is, or it has in those early games, but I don't think it's time to sort of dispense with Dan Neil's captaincy or anything like that. That's a little bit too far for me. The tackle is daft, yes, of course. It's unneeded. Watching it live, I thought maybe it's last ditch, and he's felt like he had to make that tackle. But when you watch the replay, I think it's Serkins is there covering. So yes, it's a dangerous situation. But did he really need to jump in? Probably not. He'll live and learn. It'll hurt him a lot because he's a professional. It's his club. And he's captain in that club. It comes within the context as well as he got that red card against Burnley. He's had a red card against Middlesbrough as well last season, and I think Sheffield United away from memory the season before. So you could argue that he does have a red card in him every now and again. The flip side to that is he's come out and taken responsibility, which is good. We spoke to Trey Hume after the game. He's held his hands up, so he absolutely needs to learn from his actions, because it has ultimately cost the team a point or 3 points. Where I sort of go a little bit awry is this sort of heavy criticism of Dan Neil, and the sort of the suggestion that he isn't actually a really, really good player. Like he is. He's a good footballer. I described him as a wonderful footballer after the game, and I stand by that. I think he is. He's going through a little bit of a dip in form. The maturity he's shown, actually, given his age, to come in and play a withdrawn role for Sunderland ever since Corey Evans was injured, really. He's played further back, which isn't his natural game, I don't think. And for the most part, he's done it well. Yes, there's been games where there's been mistakes and a little bit of ill discipline, but I just don't think we should be crucifying the lad. It's absolutely fair to speculate about the captaincy. I think that's a very valid discussion point. It's a very valid discussion point to talk about whether he's good in a 6 or whether he should be playing further forward, whether Salis comes in when he's fit and pushes Dan Neil forward. I think it's valid to say, does Dan Neil need a couple of games out of the team, with Alan Brown hopefully approaching fitness? But I think this suggestion that he's no good, this suggestion that there's not a player there, is just wrong for me, because I think there is a player there. We should be sort of rallying around him and protecting him. And there's a reason big clubs want Dan Neil. There's been a suggestion as well that his contract situation might be sort of weighing on his mind. I don't think that would be the case. I mean, there's still 2 years left on his deal. Obviously, don't know the player, haven't spoken to him, but I think he's a really good professional. So I'm not sure that that's an issue. But again, as I said earlier, you know, good performances against Derby and Leeds and all will be forgotten. But I just think that the amount of good that Dan Neil has done for Sunderland over his sort of 2.5, 3 seasons, whatever it is now in the team, outweighs the bad. I get it; it's frustrating, but you know, let's not crucify him.
Yeah, I mean, I always see Dan Neil as like something of a litmus test. You know, I think there are those who really see him for what he is and who really appreciate him. And then there are some who maybe, you know, scapegoat him just a little bit. And I sometimes wonder if it's maybe, you know, a little bit easier to do that because he is an academy graduate and because he is sporting the armband as well. I think maybe one of the big questions that people have is that because he's being given the armband, then how easy is it to take him out of that team? Because Sunderland have the options now. Samed, like you say, coming to fitness, he is a natural sitting player who was playing Champions League football last year. Alan Brown's been wonderful since he joined the club in the few performances that we've seen from him prior to the injury. So does the captain's armband, I suppose, does that make it harder to drop Neil?
I sort of have mixed feelings about this. For me, no, it doesn't make it harder because 09's the club captain anyway. So surely if he's playing, he just gets the armband. So it's not really a question of like, you know, Dan Neil is the leader of this team and he's undroppable because he's captain and there's sort of nobody else behind him. Like there are other leaders in Sunderland's squad. So taking a player out of the firing line, although it might hurt his pride for sure, like I don't see it as big as an issue if he can, you know, take him out the firing line, get his head sorted a little bit maybe. But, you know, the flip side to that is that sometimes the best way to handle a mistake is just to play the next game. I remember Ekwa, I think, gave away the penalty for a 3-3 or a 4-4 draw against Hull City towards the back end of that championship playoff season. And you know, Mowbray just put him in the next game. He wasn't dropped and he actually repaid Mowbray with some really good performances. So there's two sides to the coin. I personally don't think it makes it harder to drop him, especially with Sunderland's options in midfield when everybody's fit. It does, at the end of the day, have to be a meritocracy. However, within that meritocracy, I don't agree with the school of thought that, you know, Dan Neil isn't a player, because for me, he quite clearly is. It's interesting, the homegrown academy thing. I think we do tend to be a bit harsher on our homegrown players. And I look back, and I'm not suggesting that Dan Neil's going to go and achieve everything that Jordan Henderson has in his career, but they are a similar type of player, similar position, similar stature, similar sort of pathway, although Jordan Henderson came through in the Premier League. And there were a lot of the same things that I've seen written on social media about Dan Neil were said about Jordan Henderson when he left, to be honest. So I would back Dan Neil to sort of prove the doubters wrong. And I think the discussion about his role is very valid because, and I've said this on the podcast loads of times, for me, the player Dan Neil is that player that scored against Accrington Stanley in League One, his first goal at the stadium, and like that sort of breaking the lines. I think he's good in an attacking sense. It's just circumstances that Sunderland have dictated over a large period of time that he's had to play in an unfamiliar role, in an unfamiliar position. But I actually think he's done reasonably well there. I think he's performed there with distinction at times. Yes, he's had some issues recently, but hopefully they can be ironed out. I honestly think we just sort of need to back him. For me, I think, you know, as a fan base, we need to back him. Whether he comes out of the team, I don't know, and I'm not sure. But I think, yeah, as a club and as a fan base, you sort of need to support him.
Yeah, and I think the other thing you sort of touched on it there is that, you know, given the wealth of options that Sunderland now have in the middle of the park, it really wouldn't be a surprise if you were to drop out every now and again over the course of the season, you know, and there might even be a certain amount of expectation when you look at the fact that, you know, you've got a player like Samad who's come in and Sunderland have signed him for the immediacy of this season. You know, he's on loan. It's a 1-year loan. There's not an option to buy in there. So it's not as if he's, you know, coming in, finding his feet and then make a decision on him next summer. Samad's been brought in because, you know, he's a wonderful footballer, evidently, who can play in that position, which, like you've said, has been something of a problem area of Sunderland. Not because Dan Neil hasn't played well there, because he has, but because he's not necessarily that natural sitting player that Sunderland have been lacking since Corey Evans picked up that injury, I suppose. So, for me, like, if Neil does come out of the team, and I sort of agree with you, I don't think he should be coming out of the team anytime soon, anything like that. But if there are periods of the season where he does maybe drop out for a game or two, I don't think you read too much into that. I think you look at that
No,
and
I completely agree.
it's the rotation options that Regis Labris has available to him, which a lot of Sunderland managers in recent times haven't been blessed with.
Yeah, and that was a major talking point last season, wasn't it? That Neil, Ekwet, and Job played too much football, and we couldn't rest them as much as we would have liked. So perhaps there's an element of that from last season with Neil as well, as that he's a bit sort of, a bit fatigued already. I don't know, but yeah, I think it's perfectly natural and acceptable to have a bit of rotation in there, and I don't think the captaincy should stop that. And I think Dan Neil's, he's clearly got a good temperament, I believe, anyway, from the interviews I've seen of him over the years, that if he is, if he misses out against Derby, then comes in against Leeds or vice versa, I would back him to be fine with that and be professional about it.
Absolutely. Another big selection call that was sort of forced on Labris over the weekend. Obviously, Elisa Mayenda picked up an injury, dropped out the squad. Wilson Isidore started and scored as well, it has to be said, and was generally quite impressive up top.
Yeah, I enjoyed his performance. He didn't get much in the first half, but there was a couple of occasions where, we're haunted at Sunderland, aren't we, by the spectre of Ross Stewart, because he was so good for us. And we haven't seen a player make those runs, be as powerful, as, physically aggressive as Ross Stewart for a while. I thought Isidore showed sort of glimpses of being more towards that Ross Stewart type player in terms of his physicality, in terms of sort of running in between the centre-back and the full-back. Some of the runs he made was similar. He's not exactly the same player as Ross Stewart, and I don't want to tag him with him being the new Ross Stewart, but I think he's a little bit more dynamic than perhaps some of Sunderland's options, like obviously a Naz Rusin playing up there wouldn't have been able to do what Wilson Isidore did. In terms of his physicality and his height, he offers something different to Mayenda, who I've been massively impressed with this season. So it's really important playing up front, your first start, to get that goal, and he has. So that's the monkey off the back straight away, which is something we've seen dog Sunderland players really. Naz Rusin, it took him a while. Hemir didn't get one. Mayenda, it took him alone in a whole season. So I think hugely important to get that. He seems a really good character as well from what I've seen of him. And a really good assist by Patrick Robertson, a really good run to get in there, sort of near post, and a cracking finish. So yeah, hugely positive. One of the biggest positives to come away from it. A striker scoring a goal on his first start, fantastic. And Sunderland are going to need options up top coming into Derby and Leeds. So yeah, hugely pleasing performance. I thought it was interesting though, Jace, that like when we saw him for the under-21s, he definitely looked better off the left, didn't he? He looked like electric off the left. When he played through the middle, he looked a little bit off it, but it was the opposite this time around at Watford. He looked really good through the middle.
I think that as a fan base, we're just going to have to learn to live with the fact that he's a versatile forward. Like he can do both of them, and that's absolutely fine. And we should be grateful that he can do both of them. I agree with you. We saw him for the under-21s, and he was brilliant out on the left, wasn't he? And maybe didn't quite through the middle. That being said, one aspect of his game that I was impressed with, even when he was playing up front for the 21s, was he receives the ball, and just those little smart, canny 5-yard passes that just bring runners in around him and all that sort of stuff. I think he does that really well. And I think that, if you look at Sunderland striker situation, we could talk about until we're blue in the face. We have spoken about it until we're blue in the face. We've been doing it for months now, since Stewart left, essentially, since Stewart got injured, really, if we're being honest about it. And two of the things that Sunderland strikers have maybe been lacking, you could argue, is the ability to bring those around them into the play consistently, and also the natural instinctive movement, like you say, that idea, just the impulse to get across the front post for the tap in, be there. The idea that he can run those channels and create headaches for centre-backs and full-backs simultaneously by never quite occupying a space that they would necessarily want him to be in as a defensive player. I think that those two facets to his game, if he can continue to show and build upon the things we've already seen, then there's no reason why he couldn't be a very effective player for Sunderland. And again, it's kind of coming back to what we're saying about the Neil Samed thing. You look at it now and you go like, well, okay, Mayenda's been a good player. He's scored a couple of goals. He's had a really good start of the season. Does he deserve to drop out the team? Probably not. Isidore scored at the weekend. So you look at it and you go, well, does he deserve to drop out the team? Probably not. But for the first time in a while, maybe Sunderland have genuine options. Maybe they can genuinely rotate up front. And over the course of a 46-game campaign, when you then consider the likes of Aaron Connolly and Ahmed Abdullahi to come into the fold as well, it's an unusual problem for Sunderland fans to be considering, but it's also a nice one for them to be considering.
Yeah, definitely. It's good to have those options. Obviously, with it being a 46-game season plus at least one FA Cup game in there as well, I think the squad does generally look a lot more wholesome than it did, and able to absorb a few more injuries. Although, as many people sort of pointed out against Watford, the bench was looking a little bit thin, perhaps with some of the injury issues. We should actually give a shout out. That reminds me, to Tommy Watson in the second half, because when he came on, he looked very good. I've been a Tommy Watson advocate for a long time, having watched his performances for the under-21s. But I actually thought, as substitute appearances go, when your team's lost a game without like scoring an assist, and that was pretty much as good as it gets. He recovered well from his early blunder. I think it was his first touch on the field, and it went massively wrong. But after that, I thought he was hugely, hugely positive. And all of a sudden, Sunderland have got like two really, really good wingers, because Mundle had a decent game again, actually. But Watson coming off the bench is exciting. So, hopefully over the season, that competition for places develops. Obviously, Aaron Connolly still to come in as well. And there, hopefully the injuries aren't as bad, and we're going to have that competition, because I think, generally the squad is fairly well fleshed out now, apart from fullback, I would say.
Yeah, and obviously, hopefully you would expect someone to at least try and address that in the January window, I suppose. But sorry, I thought you were going to say something.
No.
Yeah, no, the Tommy Watson thing it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I've seen a few people say that they almost feel quite sorry for him, that he's broken in the first team picture and he's behind Mundle, and Mundle is obviously playing so well that he's not going to get many minutes. But I actually think that the other school of thought of that on that is that it gives him the time, it takes the pressure off, it allows him to continue his development, whether that is floating between the 21s and the first team, whether that is as a cameo player for the first team almost exclusively. It allows him to just continue on that trajectory, because it's obvious that Tommy Watson is an immense talent. He's a wonderful footballer, and the things that he's been doing for the 21s now for weeks, months on end, the individual goals that he scores, the ability that he has to literally take a game and change the entire course of it on his own, that can't be understated. But it's also a huge step coming up into the first team. And I think that if we were looking at a situation where, Mundle wasn't firing, and suddenly you're looking at Tommy Watson as an 18-year-old, let's not forget, to be in that first team, to take up the mantle that Jack Clark has left, then that's a huge amount of pressure. Whereas I think where we're at right now, again, you talk about depth, and it's the beauty of that depth. Mundle has started the season on fire. He's arguably been one of, if not Sunderland's best players. And then if Watson can just sort of sneak under the radar a little bit, suddenly in a year and a half's time, maybe he has that first team explosion, and then suddenly Sunderland have another real player on their hands.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and you're wholeheartedly right to raise the point that he is actually 18 and only turned 18 in April. So he's still really, really young. So whilst I get it and understand it, and I've done so myself, calling for Tommy Watson to get minutes, particularly towards the back end of last season, I just thought, if not now, then when? But obviously Sunderland had Jack Clark, and he was coming back to fitness and such, like, with a view to sell him in the summer probably. So they probably wanted him out on the field. But he is a huge talent. We've seen it for the under-21s, and he looks and moves like Jack Clark as well. He's almost like a little bit of a Jack Clark clone. But yeah, I think it's sensible just to ease him in. I'm sure he'd love to play more, but having that experience around the first team, especially when they're winning and stuff like that, I think will be invaluable. But yeah, I'm looking forward to him getting minutes here and there. It would be lovely if we got like with all respect in the world to a National League club, but a National League club in the FA Cup and he could start. I think that would be absolutely class. But yeah, hugely talented. And I would suggest actually if Brighton are bidding for you in the summer, their scouts tend to be fairly on the money with most things. So you must be pretty decent, I would suggest.
Yeah, again, if you talk about litmus tests, I think popping up on Brighton's immense database is it's probably about as good as it gets, isn't it?
Yeah.
Speaking of Sunderland players who are popping up on illustrious databases, Chris Rigg, linked with the biggest clubs in Europe, James, Real Madrid, Borussia Dortmund, Bayern Munich, Manchester United, and now Birmingham City. I mean, this, no disrespect to Birmingham City, but this feels like a bit of a wild one, doesn't it? Do you want to just maybe talk us through that story, the breaking of it, and also what the hell is going on?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Obviously, it wasn't our story that Birmingham are interested this time around as a League One club. That came from Alan Nixon from the Sun. I think a few things you have to talk about is Birmingham City is splashing the cash at the moment. So the story comes within that context. Obviously, they paid I think it was 10 to 15 million quid for Jay Stansfield. So they've got money, they can spend it, and they can actually spend it better in League One. So I'm guessing that's where this story sort of comes from. So I actually don't doubt that there's probably a little bit of interest. And I don't doubt actually that Chris Rigg has been on Birmingham City's radar, because he was on Birmingham City's radar last season when Tony Mowbray was the coach and the new owners had just come in. I know that for certain that Birmingham City looked at him and Tony Mowbray was driving that. So he's probably a name that's been mentioned at the club, but he's a name that's been mentioned at a lot of clubs. And whether Birmingham City as a League One club could ever get him, especially for £10 million, because I think he's worth a lot more than that already, to be honest, is probably sort of fanciful for them from their perspective. I don't think that's a move that would ever happen. So as I say, on that particular story, I don't doubt that there is a little bit of interest. I don't doubt that, people at Birmingham City have talked about Chris Rigg, because why wouldn't you? But I think being able to get him for 10 million as a League One club is completely pie in the sky, not going to happen. So obviously that when that story came out, it sort of drew a lot of criticism and attention, and I completely understand, and I get where it's coming from, because it is ridiculous, really. It's a ridiculous thought. It's a ridiculous sort of scenario, but their owners are a bit wild, really, aren't they? I mean, fair play to them. They're having a right go in League One, and they've paid a lot of money. But whilst it sounds silly, really, and it is silly, the thought of Chris Rigg going to Birmingham City as things stand, I do genuinely believe that it's probably an accurate story in a sense. So it's like there's the reality of it, which is it's probably never going to happen. But I think the other reality of it is that there is actually probably some interest there, as bizarre as it sounds. And again, I'll stress that loads of clubs are probably thinking like that, because he is that good. So there's probably, there's clubs up and down the land. I don't know this for certain, but we mentioned Brighton there. I bet you he's in Brighton's database. He's been looked at by Manchester United, Liverpool, Newcastle United. They'd be keen as well. Probably every Premier League club has got him on their list. So yeah, there's a huge amount of interest in him because of the player he is. But let's face it, he's not going to Birmingham City in League One. That's not happening. If he's leaving for Sunderland, it's going to be for a top-level elite club, I think. So it is a bizarre story. I think there's probably some truth to it, but it's just never going to happen. That would be my sort of analysis of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm tempted to agree with you, to be perfectly honest. I think Maybe they just want revenge for Joe Bellingham. Who can say? Maybe give us a bit of a bloody nose. I think that the two things I would say on this, right? The first thing is that Sunderland could hardly be in a stronger position when it comes to Chris Rigg. He's only just signed his professional contract. That's long term. I mean, is it 2027 that runs till? Something like that, 27, 28. So there's a few years left on that. He's playing. He's in the first team. He seems to be absolutely loving his time at the club at the moment, you know. So it's not as if he could necessarily be tempted by the prospect of greater first team opportunities elsewhere right now, because he's made himself integral to Labrissa's plans as things stand. But the other thing that I would say is just sort of, you know, scrolling through social media after the story or doing the rounds, you kind of get the impression that fans of other clubs still don't quite realise just how good this boy is. And you know, the longer that remains the case, the happier I am, because if he did his whole career or something, I'd be buzzing, because he is a special player, and we spoke about him before, you know. But there were people talking about, you know, Birmingham fans talking about the Stansfield fee and looking at it and going, well, if we bought a Premier League prospect for this much, then surely a Championship prospect would be this much in relation to that. And I think that, you know, as this season progresses, it's going to become more and more undeniable that Chris Rigg is destined for the very, very top. And I think that, like I say, right now, maybe if you are unaware of who he is, maybe if you're not watching Sunderland every week like we are, you might look at it from a Birmingham perspective and go, well, you know, we're a club on the up, we've got someone, he's a young player, why couldn't we make this work? But I think that the more minutes he gets in a Sunderland shirt, the more apparent it's going to become to everybody, and not just Sunderland fans, that Chris Rigg is genuinely something a little bit different. Like, you know, he is something that's going to take off at some point. And I think if any fan base should eventually come to empathise with that, it would be Birmingham, because let's not forget, this is the club who retired Jude Bellingham's number, got roundly laughed out of the place for it, and now I think everybody at some point has probably issued them some sort of apology and just said, you know, might have got that one wrong, lads, because, you know, the Rigg Bellingham comparisons, while I don't think that they necessarily serve Rigg particularly well, because I don't like that sort of thing, I think that it's unnecessary, and I think that it puts pressure on players where there doesn't need to be. I do also think that you can understand why people are making them. And like I say, the longer this goes on, the more I think it's going to become apparent that, yeah, you're right, Chris Rigg is probably not going to be going to Birmingham City.
Yeah, and he's worth more than 10 million already, isn't he, really? Let's face it. Like, I think Chris Rigg as a player, for me, the potential, and we always have a tendency to overvalue our own players, don't we? Because we watch them week in, week out, but it's like 20 to 30 million for me, and then you're looking at like a whole range of add-ons and a sell-on percentage. I think the only problem Sunderland would run into is that when they get to the summer, obviously there'll probably be interest in January, but I couldn't see him leaving in January. When they get to the summer, he'll only have 1 year left of his first professional deal, won't he? So it'll be either have him sign a new contract, or you'd have to get your money for him sort of next summer, if that makes sense. So that would certainly, I think, be one to watch. But at the moment, I mean, I think we discussed it in the podcast, or maybe it was on one of the On the Whistle videos, but it's just like, just enjoy him. Just enjoy him while we've got him, because he is that good. And I know he had a bit of a shaky opening 30 or 45 minutes against Watford, but he's a joy to watch. His tenacity, his aggression is absolutely brilliant. And there'll be more stories like this, I imagine, over the coming months, with some clubs higher up the food chain. But yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of noise, but just enjoy him while he's here.
And another transfer story from over the weekend, James. Anthony Patterson, more interesting name, apparently.
Yeah, this sort of won't go away. This Patterson being linked with top level clubs. A player actually that came in for a little bit of criticism after the Plymouth game, didn't he? So some parallels to sort of Dan Neil in a sense, like local lad, made a few mistakes. I think the sort of the interest from the likes of Arsenal and Liverpool, Celtic, I understood that was genuine in the summer. But in terms of like the Premier League clubs he would be going to, obviously Manchester United, the latest to be linked, it's usually as a number 2, as a backup, with a view to maybe coming number 1 in the future. Now, whether you agree that Anthony Patterson could be a number one for like a top 6 Premier League club, I think there's a fair debate around that, given some of the deficiencies in his game. But the reality of him is that I'll just check the figures, but he is 24 years old, which is really, really young for a goalkeeper, and he's played 143 senior games in all competition, with a loan at Notts County in there as well. So clubs will look at that and they'll see value there, and they'll probably see potential resale value as well. But I think it is, for Sunderland fans, you look at it and go, well, there are still a few deficiencies to his game. Obviously, his distribution is the main one. Would that stop him from being a top-level Premier League keeper, and then stop him from taking that step from being a number 2 to a number 1 at a top 6 Premier League club? I think there's definitely a debate to be had about that. So in terms of the player, I think his stance was that he was happy playing for Sunderland last season, and he didn't want to go anywhere and be a number 2. If he was to go somewhere and be a number 2, it would be sort of a guarantee of European games or cup games, or, you know, X amount of starts here and there. So it's really, really interesting. But his sale would represent like pure profit to Sunderland, so it could allow them to manoeuvre in the market further on down the line. We know this model sort of relies on 1 or 2 player sales every summer to reinvest. Could I see Patterson becoming one of those eventually? Yes, absolutely. I'm in no rush to sell him because I rate him and I think he's done well for Sunderland. But I just do wonder about that deficiency in terms of his kicking, which I don't think actually is as bad as people make out. I think he's had a few dodgy games, which you would expect for a young goalkeeper, and I still categorise him as a young goalkeeper because 24 is really young for a goalkeeper. Yes, he's got a decent level of championship experience. Would that stop him sort of going on and becoming a fully fledged like top end Premier League goalkeeper? Very possibly. But, you know, 30 games in the Premier League with Premier League coaches might change that. I don't know. So I rate Anthony Patterson highly. I think that there is probably interest. Could I see him going in January? Absolutely not. I don't think there's any chance of that. Could I see him going at some point with Sunderland looking to reinvest the money? Possibly, yeah. But he's definitely one of Sunderland's success stories out of the academy. And I have absolutely no issue with him staying longer than January, longer than the summer, 2-3 years, because I rate him highly. I think his shot stopping ability is tremendous.
Yeah, I would echo all of that, to be fair. I think that, you know, if there is a weakness in his game at the moment, it is his kicking. I agree that I don't think it is as direly catastrophic as some people would have you believe. And I think the other thing to point out is that there are moments in matches, even where his kicking hasn't been fantastic, where he's produced 40-yard diagonals, and you look at it and you go, this boy, he can play football. He's got a good peg on him. It's just that it's maybe not quite there on a consistent basis. And I think that if he can just alter that slightly, if he can just make sure that fewer of those passes are going astray, fewer are going out of play, then, you know, it won't be a problem whatsoever. The one thing I would say is that a lot of the clubs that he's being linked with, you know, the likes of Arsenal, Man United, even Tottenham, there's such a high emphasis on the goalkeeper being able to play out from the back. And so that's kind of the one thing where he's at currently, and I do believe he can improve, and I do believe that he's not as bad as people say. Where he's at currently, it does come as a little bit of a surprise to me that, say, for instance, an Arsenal would be looking at him and going, yeah, I think he could be the successor to David Raya, because it's only this summer that they've got rid of Aaron Ramsdale because Mikel Arteta seemingly didn't trust him with the ball at his feet. So it's a bit of a weird sort of anomaly for me. But certainly, you know, we're talking about the fact that Tommy Watson's attracting interest from Brighton. This is another one where Patterson has his detractors, but the fact that he is consistently being linked with the likes of a Liverpool, a Manchester United, a Tottenham, it would suggest that he's probably doing something right.
Yeah, I think he's definitely doing a lot of things right. But I think, you know, it's interesting, isn't it? You mentioned, you know, Arsenal, Liverpool, Manchester United. It's interesting that how they're viewing Anthony Patterson, which is a compliment to him, because obviously, you know, they think he's good enough to come in and play for their football club. But the impression I get is that it would be like squarely as a number 2. Like I don't see him linked with any of these top 6 clubs coming in to take the place of a David Raya or anything. It's always within the context as he would be firmly number 2 with a view maybe later on. So in terms of his career progression, is that really worth it? Probably not. Probably wants to keep on playing games. So I think again, like Rigg, like there's going to be a lot of talk and a lot of chatter, but for all of the interest actually in Anthony Patterson, which there was interest in Anthony Patterson from Wolves and Leicester, like probably 18 months ago, I don't think anybody's actually come in with a bid for him yet. Sunderland are really, really protected in terms of the contract. So for all the chatter and stuff, nobody's actually come forward with any money yet and made Sunderland sort of make a decision. So it's interesting. I don't doubt there's interest, obviously, but none of that interest has actually materialised into a bid yet. So that's probably worth noting as well, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably all we've got time for, to be fair, James. So we'll wrap it up there. But you can join us again next week, and we'll be discussing all of the latest Sunderland news and developments. In the meantime, you can follow along with all of the latest Black Cats news at the Sunderland Echo, or you can give us both a follow on social media as well. Thanks to James. Thanks to you for listening. See you again next week. Goodbye.